The Underground Railroad, America's Secret Network. Chapter 5: Unsung Stationmasters. Part 5.1. Levi Coffin, the president of the Underground Railroad. He was a merchant. He sold dry goods, bolts of cloth, barrels of salt, coffee, sugar, to most people in Fountain City, Indiana. He looked like any other respectable Quaker businessman. But behind the storefront, behind the smile and the ledgers and the squeaky wooden floors, Levi Coffin ran something else. Something illegal, something sacred, something that would make him, in the words of his enemies and admirers alike, the president of the Underground Railroad. And like any good president, he had a cabinet, a network, a war to fight. But his war wasn't for land or money or pride. It was for freedom, and the soldiers were runaways, mothers, children, strangers, each one desperate, each one hunted, each one welcomed into his home with the same phrase: "You are safe here," even if it meant Levi's own life wasn't. He was born in 1798 in Guilford County, North Carolina, to a devout Quaker family who believed slavery was a sin against both man and God. But in the South, sin and economy were often the same thing. At 15, Levi Coffin saw his first slave auction. He watched a mother sold away from her children, and something inside him broke. That night, he helped a fugitive hide in a hollowed log near his father's field. It was his first act of resistance, but not his last. He would go on to help more than 3.00 people escape slavery, more than any single individual in American history. Aside from Harriet Tubman, except Tubman had to stay on the move, Coffin built a fortress. In 1826, Levi and his wife Catherine moved to Newport, Indiana, modern-day Fountain City, a state where slavery was technically illegal, but where the fugitive slave laws still held sway. They purchased a modest two-story brick house on the main road. But what they did next turned it into something closer to a secret fortress. Behind the stairs, they built false walls. Under the floorboards, they installed ventilation shafts. One bedroom had a hidden hatch, leading to a crawl space that could fit up to 17 people at once. And beneath the pantry, a tunnel, narrow, dark, sloping away from the house toward the backfields. A second exit, a way out, if the law ever came knocking. And it did, many times. Levi Coffin was threatened, boycotted, dragged to court, denounced in newspapers, and once surrounded by a mob that threatened to burn his house down. But each time, he stood firm. He once wrote in his journal, "I would rather be guilty of breaking the law than guilty of breaking God's commandment." Here's what people don't understand about Levi Coffin. He wasn't just brave, he was strategic. He turned the entire town of Newport into a hub of the Underground Railroad. He convinced shopkeepers, blacksmiths, even postmasters to join. He helped develop coded letters and shipment schedules that disguised human cargo as dry goods. He met with stationmasters in Ohio, Illinois, and Pennsylvania to build consistent routes. He even used his own business, selling textiles and imports, as a cover to transport fugitives hidden in wagons under bolts of cloth. People came to call his home the Grand Central Station of the railroad, and they called him president. He would laugh at the title. "Well," he once joked, "I suppose I've got more constituents than Congress, and they don't lie nearly as often." But behind the wit was something else. Conviction. Levi believed every soul had value, even the ones who betrayed him. Which brings us to the twist. One bitter winter, a young man came to his door. He was alone, ragged, bleeding from his feet. Coffin brought him in, fed him, tended his wounds, gave him shelter. The next morning, that man vanished. 3 nights later, bounty hunters arrived. They had a warrant, they had names. That man had turned Levi in. He had sold the information for money. A betrayal. The townspeople were furious. Some said to close the house, seal the passages. But Levi kept the door open. He simply said, "If I help only the trustworthy, then I am not serving freedom. I am only protecting myself." Forgiveness, too, is resistance. That act of mercy in the face of betrayal was more than moral. It was revolutionary. The risks were real. If caught, Levi and Catherine could have lost their home, their children, their freedom, but they never backed down. Together, they helped hundreds in Indiana alone. And after moving to Cincinnati in 1847, they continued the work. Levi joined the Western Freedmen's Aid Society. He raised money, built schools, wrote his memoir, Reminiscences of Levi Coffin, a record of courage, cunning, and quiet rebellion. He died in 1877, nearly 80 years old, but his story never really ended, because every runaway who made it carried a piece of Levi with them. In a blanket, a meal, a door that opened in the night. Next up, Part 5.2. John Rankin, The Lantern on the Hill. What if the only thing standing between freedom and death was the flicker of a lantern on a hill? In the next chapter, we meet the man who lit that flame and never let it die. Stay with us. If you're intrigued by these hidden heroes of the Underground Railroad, subscribe to MetaFacts Legends. We uncover stories like theirs that the textbooks often overlook. Check out the description for even more eye-opening details about these unsung station masters. Part 5.2. John Rankin, The Lantern on the Hill. It began with a light, one small lantern in a high window. Night after night, it flickered above the banks of the Ohio River, a quiet signal, barely visible to the human eye. But to those crossing from Kentucky, that faint glow meant everything, because it wasn't just a light. It was a promise that they weren't alone, that someone was waiting, that freedom had a front porch. And at the heart of it all stood John Rankin, minister, abolitionist, father of 30, and keeper of the flame. For more than 40 years, he kept that lantern burning, and it almost cost him everything. Born in 1793 in Tennessee, John Rankin was raised in a world where slavery was as common as the Bible, and often twisted into it. But by his 20s, he'd become a firebrand abolitionist, publicly condemning the system from pulpits and pamphlets across the South. It didn't go over well. By 1822, facing threats to his family and church, he moved north, settling in the quiet riverside town of Ripley, Ohio. But Rankin didn't go to Ripley to retire. He went there to build a lighthouse for the hunted. His home, perched high atop Liberty Hill, looked down over the winding Ohio River. To the south, Kentucky, still enslaved. To the north, Ohio, nominally free, but the river in between. That was the boundary between slavery and salvation. And for those fleeing in the night, Rankin's lantern was the North Star made human. He lit it every night. Rain, snow, wind, war. He lit it not because he was fearless, but because he knew someone out there was more afraid than he was. And then came Eliza, the story that made Rankin a legend. You've heard of it, maybe in Uncle Tom's Cabin, where Harriet Beecher Stowe fictionalized the moment. But it really happened. Winter, 1838. Eliza Harris, a young enslaved woman from Kentucky, had overheard that she was about to be sold. And worse, separated from her infant son. So she ran, at night, in the cold, with her baby in her arms, and hounds behind her. She reached the Ohio River, but it was frozen. Not solid, just barely. Most would have turned back. But Eliza, she stepped onto the ice. Carrying her baby, she jumped from floe to floe, her shoes soaked, her fingers bleeding, while slave catchers and dogs howled from the opposite bank. She slipped, stumbled, got back up. Her baby didn't cry. She made it to shore. And there, at the base of Liberty Hill, a light was waiting. Rankin's lantern. He took her in, fed her, dried her feet, and when morning came, he took her baby in his arms and climbed the hill to safety. Eliza was one of more than 2.00 fugitives who passed through the Rankin house. But she became a symbol of them all, and the lantern became a symbol of him. But it wasn't easy. Rankin was hated by pro-slavery mobs. Twice, groups from Kentucky crossed the river to threaten his life. Once, a letter arrived with a single matchstick and the words, "Burn, preacher." His neighbors begged him to stop, but Rankin refused. He simply wrote back, "Your fire can burn my house, but not my witness." Rankin's sons, particularly Wallace Rankin, became deeply involved in the underground work. Wallace led night rides, built safe houses, and even faced down bounty hunters at gunpoint. The Rankin family as a whole became a generational engine of freedom. And yet they never once asked for recognition. They didn't get paid, they didn't keep records, they just kept the light on. In one diary entry from 1852, John Rankin wrote, "I light this lamp not for myself, but for the man I may never meet, for the woman whose name I may never know, for the child who will grow up free because I was awake tonight." What made Rankin remarkable wasn't just his courage. It was his consistency. 44 years, through war and peace, through presidents and preachers, through despair and hope, the lantern never went out. He died in 1886, in the same house, overlooking the same river, and today, that home still stands. Visitors can climb the hill, stand at the same window, and if you go at dusk, when the wind is right, some say you can still see a faint flicker, a whisper from the past, a signal across time that courage needs no audience, and light always finds its way through the dark. Next up, Part 5.3, The Black Stationmasters, Hidden in Plain Sight. Not all stationmasters were white. In fact, some of the boldest, smartest, and most vital leaders in the Underground Railroad were free black Americans who risked everything, including their limited freedom, to help others. And one of them helped a man he didn't know was his brother. Stay with us. Part 5.3, The Black Stationmasters, Hidden in Plain Sight. They were invisible, hidden in plain sight. The stationmasters who weren't just allies in the Underground Railroad. They were the silent architects of freedom itself. They didn't march in parades. They didn't have statues built in their honor. They weren't celebrated in history books. They were the black men and women who, despite facing the oppressive weight of racism, slavery, and violence, turned their own communities into sanctuaries. They risked everything, family, home, freedom, even life, to help others escape. But they were never acknowledged. Not even now. Their names, mostly forgotten, but their courage, it still reverberates. One such person was William Still, a man who quietly documented the lives of hundreds of fugitive slaves. He didn't write speeches, he didn't lead armies, he didn't hold a banner, but what he did hold was a pen, and with it, he preserved a record that history almost erased. Still was born in 1821 in New Jersey to enslaved parents who were freed when he was a child. When the family moved to Philadelphia, he witnessed firsthand the agony of separation, seeing families ripped apart and souls trapped in bondage. But what made him different was his determination to fight that oppression. Not just in the streets, but in the records. When William Still became an official stationmaster in Philadelphia, he opened his doors to freedom seekers. But he did more than simply offer a warm meal or a place to rest. He wrote their stories. Every time a runaway came to him, Still didn't just hide them. He interviewed them. He documented their backgrounds, their journey, their experiences, names, ages, family details, everything. Even though the Fugitive Slave Act made it a criminal offense to assist an escaped slave, Still took the risk of writing their names, a move that would ultimately place him in grave danger. But he did it anyway. Why? Because he understood something fundamental. Without the stories, there were no names, and without the names, they were lost. Still recorded everything meticulously, each name, each story, each person who passed through his station, every piece of their history. One of his most profound quotes from his memoir, The Underground Railroad Records, is, "Each name I wrote was another secret buried in the soil of this country." This was truth-telling, written on paper, but it was also a subversive act. For each name he wrote down, Still was creating a resistance to the erasure of the enslaved people's lives. He gave them the only thing slavery tried to take from him, identity. But as much as Still helped others, his own life was marked by a deep personal twist. One of the most heart-wrenching moments in Still's life came when, in 1851, a man named Peter Still, who had been enslaved and was eventually freed, appeared at William Still's station. Peter Still had been sold as a child. His family had been split apart. His brothers and sisters scattered across the South. His mother was eventually freed, but Peter had no idea where his siblings were. In fact, he had no idea if they were still alive. When Peter appeared in Philadelphia, he sought refuge with William Still. But the twist, Peter Still was William's brother, a brother William had believed dead for over 20 years. Still did not recognize him at first. Peter had been sold away at a young age. The memory of his brother had faded, but when they finally reconnected, it wasn't just a reunion. It was an emotional revelation. Still had been fighting for the freedom of countless people, but his own brother had been lost in the system. He had been right under his nose. This moment, and the way Still handled it, reveals the heartbreaking complexity of the Underground Railroad. People didn't just rescue strangers. They were rescuing family. They were fighting against the violent system that had torn their families apart, systematically and deliberately. But Still, like so many other stationmasters, didn't just resist for the people he knew. He resisted for everyone. And in this case, his brother. This twist, the emotional price of fighting for freedom, wasn't just part of history. It was part of his story, a story of love lost and found. But William Still's actions weren't an isolated incident. He wasn't the only one who risked everything for freedom. Still was part of a larger network, an invisible army of black and white abolitionists who operated in secrecy, in defiance of both the law and society, and they were hidden in plain sight. Take, for example, Henry Box Brown, who escaped slavery by literally mailing himself to freedom. Still was deeply involved in aiding that escape. Then there was William Wells Brown, another man of courage, who took up the cause of abolitionism and documented his own experiences. Their stories intersected with Still's, as all of them worked to create a chain of survival. But Still's story, his legacy, his gift to history, remains one of the most powerful, because he understood what history could do to the forgotten, what a nation in denial could erase. Through him, their names survived. It's a painful irony that Still, one of the most important figures in the Underground Railroad, was never properly recognized during his lifetime. No monuments, no formal acknowledgements. He died penniless in 1902, but the stories he preserved, they outlived him. And today, we remember those stories, those names, thanks to William Still, the unsung hero of the Underground Railroad. Next up, Part 5.4, The Unexpected Ones, Women, Children, Outsiders. In the next chapter, we focus on the hidden heroes of the Underground Railroad, the ones who defied expectations, who risked everything, and who taught us that sometimes the most unexpected people play the biggest roles in history. Stay with us. Part 5.4, The Widow and the Cats. The scene starts with a soft meow. It was a sound that some found comforting, others eerie, but to the people who sought refuge in her home, it was more than a noise, it was a lifeline. Her name was Sarah Johnson, a widow living in the small town of Saratoga Springs, New York. Sarah was known around town as a cat lady. She kept more than a dozen cats, and anyone who visited her home was greeted by their incessant meowing, darting shadows, and the constant sound of paws padding across wooden floors. But to outsiders, she wasn't just a cat lady. She was a peculiar woman, someone people whispered about. They said she was odd, maybe a little mad, but they never understood. They didn't know what her home was truly for. For Sarah wasn't just feeding the cats, she was feeding hope. Sarah had always been a quiet woman, but after losing her husband, she withdrew even further. Her life revolved around her small home. the cats, and the delicate balance she maintained with the community. She wasn't wealthy, she wasn't famous, she was, by all accounts, just another widow in a quiet town. But when the war for freedom came knocking at her door, Sarah answered. By the mid-1850s, word had spread about the Underground Railroad in New York. Refugees, escaping the horrors of slavery, needed shelter, they needed guidance, and Sarah, with her quiet demeanor and secluded life, was in the perfect position to help. For 3 long years, Sarah secretly harbored more than 40 fugitive slaves, hiding them in her basement. In a space barely big enough for herself, let alone a small army. But the most incredible part of it all wasn't the number of people she hid. It wasn't the space in her basement or the number of days she spent in fear of discovery. The most remarkable part was her signal. Every night, when Sarah would hear the faintest knock at her door, when she knew someone was waiting outside, she would signal, not with a loud bell or an overt sign, but with her cats. You see, Sarah had trained them. She had lived in that house long enough to know the habits of her furry companions. And she used them as a clever code. If the cats were meowing loudly, the coast was clear. If they were silent, or if Sarah shushed him abruptly, it meant danger was near, and the people hiding below in the basement would remain perfectly still. To the casual passerby, it might have seemed like a normal night, but to those hiding in the shadows, those cats were the difference between life and death. One evening, a group of bounty hunters came to town. They were notorious, merciless, and they had been hunting Sarah's guests for weeks. They knocked on her door. The cats were quiet. Sarah's pulse quickened. She opened the door with a smile, feigning confusion as the men asked if she had seen any runaways. Sarah just stood there, pretending to be startled, as the cats softly meowed behind her. She knew she couldn't let them in, but just as the hunters began questioning her, the cats did something unexpected. They started to meow louder, then they raced through the hallway, directly toward the window. The bounty hunters looked confused, their suspicion starting to waver. "That's odd," one of them said. "What are they up to?" In that moment, Sarah knew they were buying time. The meows had been the signal to stay hidden. Sarah's guests in the basement were already holding their breath, staying perfectly still as the hunters moved closer to the door. And then, the hunters left. They never returned. No one ever learned why they'd been stopped. But to Sarah, it didn't matter. What mattered was that, for one more night, the cats had done their job. The people she'd hidden was safe. Her role in the Underground Railroad was quiet, unnoticed by most. She didn't ask for praise. In fact, no one in the town ever suspected her involvement. But Sarah had become part of something much larger than herself. She had saved lives, not with weapons or violent resistance, but with silence and cats. It was one of the greatest acts of defiance in the history of the railroad, and one that few people would ever hear about. As Sarah's cats continued to meow, she kept the lights on, and for 40 people, those cats weren't just pets. They were the sound of survival. Next up, Part 5.4b, Josiah's Watch. In the next chapter, we meet Josiah, an 11-year-old boy who stood watch every night. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't armed, but when a single glance from a distant hill saved a life, Josiah became one of the youngest heroes in the history of the Underground Railroad. Stay with us. Do you know anyone who could have been one of these heroes in history? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, there's so much more in the description. Valuable resources and deeper insights are waiting for you. Part 5.4b, Josiah's Watch. At just 11 years old, Josiah found himself standing at the frontier of life and death. While most boys his age were concerned with school, play, and friends, Josiah had taken on a far more dangerous responsibility, watching over those fleeing slavery. Every night, he lay outside, pretending to sleep, his eyes ever watchful for signals of danger. What would make an 11-year-old boy take on such a dangerous task? The answer lies in the courage of a child raised by abolitionists. who saw a chance to make a difference, even at his young age. Born into a family of abolitionists in the heart of Ohio, Josiah was far from your typical child, with a strong moral compass and a fierce commitment to the cause of freedom. He had already seen the horrors of slavery through the eyes of those who escaped it. But as a young boy, the world around him seemed to demand more. The Underground Railroad was not just a distant idea, but a reality that needed every willing hand. Josiah's duties began innocently enough. He helped out around the house, running small errands and assisting with chores. But as he grew older, he became more and more involved in the clandestine operations of the Underground Railroad. By the time he was 11, Josiah had assumed a vital role in the nightly operations of an abolitionist family that played host to escaping slaves. Each night, Josiah's job was to lie outside, ostensibly asleep, but actually on constant alert. His home, strategically located on the path to freedom, was a critical safe house for escaping slaves making their way north. While others slept, Josiah kept watch, looking for any sign of approaching danger. When the bounty hunters came, he needed to be the first to know the most dangerous part of his job: the signals. The signal system was the lifeblood of the Underground Railroad, and Josiah, being small and agile, was able to move unnoticed. The task was clear. He had to watch for signs like the faint flicker of lanterns or the sound of approaching footsteps that would signal danger. Once, he had saved an entire group of escaping slaves by noticing the signal of a lantern too far away to be seen from inside the house. It was one of those nights when the bounty hunters almost made it to the house before Josiah spotted them, running to warn the escapees just in time. One particular night, the tension was thick in the air. Josiah lay on the porch, staring up at the dark, unblinking sky. Suddenly, he saw it, a flicker of movement in the distance. A lantern, a sign of danger. The group had been warned earlier, but Josiah wasn't taking any chances. Without thinking, he jumped up, running through the shadows, using his small size and nimbleness to avoid detection. He raced through the back door to warn his family and the passengers that danger was near. They quickly huddled together, readying themselves to move to the next safe house. The group was safe, for now. But here was the twist: at just 11, Josiah was not only doing the work of an adult, he was also shouldering the enormous weight of responsibility. His actions, his decisions, could mean life or death for those he was protecting. The fear of making a mistake haunted him, but Josiah never wavered. What drove him? A profound belief that freedom was worth risking everything for. One cold night, while lying on the porch, Josiah heard the faintest sounds of barking in the distance. Bounty hunters had brought the dogs. The tension was palpable. Josiah remained still, praying the dogs wouldn't pick up the scent of those hiding in the cellar. Just as the dogs began to growl and strain against their leashes, the last of the escaping slaves had crossed the yard to safety. Josiah's heart raced. Josiah would go on to live a full life, growing into a teacher and a passionate advocate for freedom. But his role in the Underground Railroad would always remain close to his heart. As a teacher, he would share his story with future generations, teaching them about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when the odds are against you. His experiences as a boy would shape his views on courage and responsibility. As he grew older, Josiah never forgot his nights as a lookout. The lessons he learned as a child watching over escaping slaves would continue to guide him through life. And it wasn't just Josiah. His actions were part of a larger movement, one that involved countless young people. Men, women, and children who risked their lives every day to help others. Josiah's story, though deeply personal, is just one thread in the larger narrative of the Underground Railroad. His courage was quiet, but profound. He had been part of a network of people, many of them children, who helped guide over 300,000 people to freedom. The world will never fully know the extent of their sacrifice. As Josiah's story reminds us, sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones whose names never make it into the history books. Next time you hear about a hero in the history books, remember Josiah, the silent watchers, the young souls, were often the most crucial in shaping the freedom we enjoy today. Now that 5.4b, Josiah's watch is done, we can move on to 5.4c, the girl in chains. Would you like me to proceed with that section? Part 5.4c, the girl in chains. Her name was Sarah, a name like any other. But her story, that was anything but ordinary. At just 16 years old, Sarah had grown up in a world that saw her as little more than property. She had been born into slavery in the Deep South, where the weight of oppression hung over every moment. Her family had been torn apart. She had watched her parents work in the fields under the watchful eye of their master, each day passing in quiet desperation. But Sarah wasn't just another victim of the system. She was a fighter, and it wasn't the physical battles that made her different, but the quiet defiance she carried in her heart. One night, Sarah learned something that changed her life forever. Her master was selling her younger brother. The bond they shared was unbreakable, and the thought of being separated from him was a fate too cruel to bear. Sarah had always been told that running away was impossible, that escape was a dream for others, but not for her. But that night, Sarah made a decision that would set her on a course no one would ever forget. She would escape, with nothing but the clothes on her back and her determination. Sarah ran, but this time, she didn't run alone. She ran with two others, a man named Thomas, who had once been a servant of the master, and Maggie, a fellow slave who, like Sarah, had been watching from the sidelines, waiting for a chance. The three of them began their journey north. But the stakes were high. Every moment, every step was a risk. They had to be quick, silent, and most of all, invisible. But Sarah, the young girl who had only known the life of a slave, was determined to succeed. Her first test came when the trio reached the first checkpoint, a small town where the locals were known to cooperate with the bounty hunters. The trio kept their heads low. But the twist came when Sarah realized they had been followed by two men, local hunters who had picked up the trail. In the dead of night, Sarah thought quickly. As the men drew closer, she hid Maggie and Thomas in a small shack nearby and pretended to be a white woman. The trick was simple. She donned a ragged shawl and played the part of a southern lady. Weak and sickly, as the men approached, she begged them for help, asking if they had seen her runaway slaves. The men were taken aback but saw no reason not to help. Sarah, though terrified, held her composure. She spoke slowly and with authority, hoping they wouldn't suspect the girl standing in front of them was someone they should be chasing. When the hunters left, Sarah exhaled a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. The ruse had worked, but even with that close call behind them, the group knew they couldn't afford to rest. The journey had just begun. As they continued north, Sarah's bravery was tested again, but this time, it was a much more dangerous challenge. The three travelers arrived at a large checkpoint where a group of bounty hunters had set up camp. The escapees were cornered. In a moment of sheer desperation, Sarah made a decision that would become legendary. She took a risk no one thought possible. Sarah, thinking quickly, suggested they disguise themselves. Thomas and Maggie were instructed to act as if they were family, and they would feign ownership of Sarah. To make the plan work, Sarah would have to pretend to be a slave owner, leading her property to freedom. When they approached the checkpoint, Sarah kept her head high. She walked with an air of confidence, and when the bounty hunters approached, she declared that she was bringing her slaves to the next station. They would need to verify her identity. The bounty hunters were suspicious, but after a tense exchange, they allowed the group to pass. By some miracle, Sarah had made it through yet another life-threatening encounter. As they made their way further north, they faced new challenges, but through it all, Sarah grew into a leader. Her heart, once filled with fear, now pulsed with determination, and she wasn't just helping herself, she was helping others. Every step she took was a victory for her and her companions. They finally reached Philadelphia, where Sarah was welcomed into the safety of a larger underground network. But her journey didn't end there. She would go on to help others, leading many more to freedom. Years later, Sarah wrote down her story, a story not just of escape, but of courage, of resilience, and of a young girl who defied all odds to take control of her destiny. The twist: Sarah's life didn't just change that day she ran for freedom. She became a symbol for others, proof that the power to change the world was in the hands of those who dared to act. Her journey inspired countless others to fight for their own freedom. Next up, Part 5.4D, Redemption. In the next chapter, we explore the story of a man who betrayed the very system he fought for, only to find redemption in the most unexpected way. Stay tuned. Part 5.4D, Redemption. Betrayal was an inevitable companion in the dangerous world of the Underground Railroad. Fear, desperation, and survival instincts sometimes led people to make choices that haunted them for the rest of their lives. But redemption, that was a different kind of story. This is the story of one such man, a man who once helped capture runaways, who once betrayed those who had placed their trust in him. His name was Thomas Hall, and his story is one of the most compelling examples of how even the deepest stains on a man's conscience can be cleansed by the strength of his own moral awakening. Thomas Hall had been born into a wealthy Southern family, steeped in the culture of slavery. He was a young man with the world at his feet, at least in the eyes of society. He was raised to believe that slavery was the natural order of things, and he held those beliefs close to his chest. But everything changed the day Thomas Hall saw the real cost of his beliefs. The first betrayal, in the early 1850s, when Thomas was in his mid-20s, he found himself caught up in the business of bounty hunting. It started as a job, nothing more, nothing less. He wasn't passionate about it, but it paid well, and his family expected him to contribute. But as Thomas became more deeply involved in capturing runaways, something started to break inside him. The faces of those he captured, the children torn from their families, the mothers wailing as they were separated from their babies, began to haunt him. But he kept pushing those feelings down, silencing his conscience with the excuses society had taught him. One fateful day, Thomas was part of a group that raided a small cabin in the woods, acting on a tip from a local informant. Inside, they found a family of four: a father, a mother, and two children, trying desperately to escape to the north. The father was shot during the raid, but the rest were bound and taken. The twist came when the family's youngest daughter, a girl no older than 8, looked up at Thomas and asked in a trembling voice, why. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, she just looked at him, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. In that moment, Thomas realized something he had been refusing to see. These were human beings, not property, but it was too late. The damage was done. The girl's pleading eyes stayed with him for months. But Thomas pushed the memory away. The awakening, the turning point, came when Thomas himself found a moment of weakness in the world he had been living in. Months after that raid, Thomas's father fell ill and passed away. The family's estate had to be settled, and Thomas was thrust into the role of overseeing the sale of land, slaves, and other assets. He watched as families were ripped apart, children sold off to the highest bidder, all for the sake of maintaining their family's wealth. But as he stood in that auction house, surrounded by other men and women being bought and sold, something broke inside him. Thomas could no longer pretend that this was right. He left the auction house that day and went to a small town where abolitionist meetings were held regularly. It was there that he met a group of Quakers, including Levi Coffin, the president of the Underground Railroad. They spoke to him about freedom, about human dignity, and about the call to do what was right, even when it was difficult. It was in that moment, surrounded by people who had risked everything to help others, that Thomas realized what he had to do. Redemption. Thomas returned home, and over the next several months, he began to make reparations for his past actions. He joined the Underground Railroad, not as a captor, but as a helper. His deep knowledge of the land and the ways of bounty hunters became an asset to those who fought for freedom. But the most significant act of redemption came when he encountered the very family he had betrayed. The same mother, father, and 2 children who had been captured on that fateful night years ago were part of a larger group making their way north. When he saw them again, the guilt that had been festering inside him for so long came to a head. He could see the fear in their eyes, fear that he would turn them in once again. But this time, Thomas did not hesitate. He took them in, he hid them, and he made sure they crossed the border to freedom safely. He had become the person he once thought impossible, the man who betrayed others, now risking his own life to ensure they could live free. The legacy of redemption. Thomas Hall never spoke publicly about his past actions. He didn't seek forgiveness from those he had wronged, and he didn't seek recognition for his newfound work in the Underground Railroad. Instead, he quietly lived out his days in the service of freedom. He became a symbol, not of perfection, but of human transformation, that no matter how far a person had fallen, there was always a chance for redemption. His story wasn't about the man he had been, but about the man he chose to become. As time went on, the name Thomas Hall faded from public view. He didn't write memoirs, he didn't leave behind grand speeches, but in the quiet shadows of the Underground Railroad, his name was remembered by those whose freedom he helped secure. The final twist of his story wasn't in the dramatic deeds of his life, but in the simple truth of his actions. One can betray and still redeem. He had been both part of the system and part of the resistance. And in the end, it was his choice to change that truly mattered. Next up, Part 5.5, The Hidden Helpers. In the next chapter, we take a deeper look at the unsung heroes of the Underground Railroad, those whose names were never recorded, but whose actions were critical to its success. Stay tuned. Part 5.5, The Hidden Helpers. Throughout the history of the Underground Railroad, there were unsung heroes whose names will never be known. These were the people who didn't write books, who didn't lead large movements, and whose faces didn't appear in any grand speeches or public ceremonies. They were the quiet supporters, the ones whose actions were as vital as those of the stationmasters and conductors themselves. But their stories, though often hidden in the shadows, are just as crucial to the legacy of the Underground Railroad. They were the people who didn't ask for recognition, who acted out of a deep moral obligation to right the wrongs of the world. Farmers, shopkeepers, servants, teachers, children, all of them worked to hide, protect, and guide those escaping slavery, risking their own lives in the process. Some were black, some were white, some were free, others were enslaved, yet they all shared one common trait. They believed in the cause of freedom. Take, for example, the farmers who built hidden compartments in their barns, creating secret spaces in which to hide people, sometimes for days on end, or the free black men and women who risked everything to shelter those who had escaped bondage, guiding them to the next station, or even helping them travel by boat to the northern states or Canada. They were the people who didn't ask for fame, who kept their actions quiet, sometimes because it was the only way to survive the ever-watchful eyes of the law. These hidden helpers were often the glue that held the entire Underground Railroad together. But the most extraordinary thing about them was not just their courage, but the way their efforts intertwined with the stories of the great escapes we now remember so vividly. Next up, Chapter 6, The Great Escapes. In this chapter, we dive into the boldest and most daring escapes of all. We begin with the remarkable story of Henry Box Brown, a man who literally nailed himself inside a wooden box and shipped himself to freedom. Then, we'll look at the courageous Ellen and William Craft, a couple who posed as a master and servant to escape their bonds. These are just a few examples of the desperate and brilliant ways people risked everything for freedom. And the most surprising twist, many of those who had successfully escaped, once they reached freedom, returned south, not just to free their own families, but to help rescue others. Stay tuned as we explore these stories of true bravery, ingenuity, and selflessness. The great escapes were more than acts of desperation, they were acts of defiance. And they forever changed the course of history. Every one of these station masters made a huge impact. even if their names were forgotten. If you want to keep learning about these incredible people, don't forget to subscribe, share this story with your friends, and check out the description for more links to help us preserve this hidden history.